Welcome to BioBox Labs. Today we're going to study two invertebrates, the clam and the earthworm. So get ready, put on your gloves, put on your goggles, and we're ready to go. So here we have our clam. Clams are part of a group called mollusks, and these are actually called bivalves because they have two shells. And right now you can actually see there's actually a stick sticking out of it because it's holding the two sides of the shell open so that it doesn't clamp shut. So on here you want to first look at some of the outside features. One thing you'll notice is if you look closely, you'll see there's a whole bunch of rings around it. And this is kind of like tree rings that every year the clam gets larger and it secretes more and more and more shell, and so it continues to get larger. So it's one of the things you'll notice. You'll also notice that there's a hinge down on one side. So this is where the clam shell is held together, and it tends to be more on one side than the other. So the big long oval and then the hinge is on one side. So let's now take a look inside the clam. So what we're going to want to do, there's two big muscles inside of the clam, and we're going to take a look inside. We're going to try to open it up. So what we have to do, take our scalpel, and we're going to basically saw on each side through that large muscle. I'm going to try to just saw back and forth, and I could tell I got through it. So I'm going to pivot the clam, and then I'm going to come on this side. Now, I don't want to poke through too far because all the important organs and stuff are in the middle. So just on the edge here, and I'm going to saw through till I can get through that big adductor muscle down there. So it takes a little bit of strength, and you saw back and forth until you can tell you're through it. Then we should be able to pry open the clam, and now you can see the stick fell out. So the unique thing about mollusks is that they all have three things in common. They have something called a mantle which covers them, and you can see the mantle here. It's this thin lining that's lining both sides of the clam. And you can see it here. And this mantle is actually what secretes the shell. And if you look at the shell, it's actually really quite beautiful. It's made out of mother of pearl. And some people use mother of pearl to make rings or different kinds of things like that because it's such a beautiful shade to it. So the mantle actually secretes the shell, and the inside of it is made of mother of pearl. In some oysters, it's what actually creates the actual pearl within it from this mantle. It secretes it other times. So the other things we're going to notice from the most mollusks have are another thing called a muscular foot. And if you look right here, this end of it is kind of muscular and stiff. This thing actually can stick out of the shell, and for the clam it sticks it out and it allows it to actually move along the sandy soil. Most often though, clams actually sit in one place, and they're filter feeders. They pull food in and they filter food out of the water, and then they excrete it out later. But the foot helps them move along. So they have a mantle, a foot, and the third thing they have is something called a visceral mass. And that's this large area right here that has all the rest of the organs inside of it. So all mollusks have that. Other mollusks are things such as snails or squid, slugs, even scallops. Those are all mollusks, and they have these three common features. They might look a little different, but they all have them the same. One other thing we want to look at right away, this large thing here, this flap here, and there's a flap here. When you get a chance to look at it on your own, you could maybe take your magnifying glass and look up close. These are the gills, and they're kind of ridged. So when water flows through into the clam, it actually collects oxygen out of the water and secretes carbon dioxide back into it. So this is how they breathe. They're through these huge gills. So you can see that it's really important for them. So now we can see these big adductor muscles here and here. These are what we cut when we had to get through. Now you can see why the clams are shut so tight. If you ever go down to the ocean, you pick up a clam, you can see why it's so hard to pry them open, because they have these huge adductor muscles that help to open and close the shell. So now what we're going to want to do is look inside this visceral mass so we can see some of the organs. Mostly what we're going to see inside here, and we're going to dissect it real carefully, just peel off some of the top section of it. Now you can see inside, and you can see that primarily what is inside is digestive tissue. And I'll just look at there. Right here, you can see the digestive gland right here, that's green portion of it. And if you look carefully, and maybe you'll be able to, when you're doing your dissection, peel away a little bit more of it, you might see some little tubes, and those are the intestines going back and forth. There's also reproductive structures inside of here. These are all the things that keep the clam living. On the back here is this dark strand here. This is actually their blood vessel that circulates blood around in their body. Their blood doesn't circulate quite like ours does. It actually just goes one direction. But you can see that there's actually blood in here as well. So this is a clam. It's actually quite simple inside, but it has, again, remember the three things from a mollusk: the mantle, the muscular foot, and the visceral mass. That's what makes it a mollusk. So hopefully you enjoy your dissection on that. Now let's dissect an earthworm. Earthworms are part of a group called annelids, and many of these are distinguished by the fact that they have segments. If you look closely along here, you can see that there's little ridges all the way along the length of the earthworm. And amazingly, there are very distinct structures at a lot of those particular segments. So it's very unique that way. So we're going to take a look at some of the structures inside of there. One of the first things you'll look at on this outside is that on one side of the earthworm, it's rather dark. It's on the back or dorsal side. Whereas on the stomach side, in a sense, well, not really their stomach, but on the underside, it's much, much lighter. So that's one way you can tell with that. They don't really have a head, or have a tail, but when they scrunch up and move, you can kind of tell that this is the area toward the front of them, whereas this lighter area back here, which is smaller, is toward the back. One of the things you'll notice that's different from a clam here is that they end up having a mouth, and you can tell the difference between the mouth and the anus, where waste comes out, is the anus is just a small opening, whereas the mouth almost looks like lips if you look at it really close. It's amazing. So that side is one way you can tell that it's the mouth on that end. Another way you can tell is because toward the mouth region, there's this light colored band up toward that area, and this is called the clitellum. And the clitellum secretes mucus, and mucus is important. We kind of sometimes think about, oh, mucus, it's slimy, but actually it's a good thing. For earthworms, one of the reasons is because it coats the entire body with this slimy stuff. So when they slither through the sand or through dirt, they don't get scratched. They actually can slide through more easily because they're covered with this mucus. The other thing the mucus does is when it coats the body, it actually allows them to absorb oxygen through the soil and through any of the air that it actually touches that mucus. Unlike the clam we saw that had gills, the earthworm doesn't have any kind of respiratory organ. So the skin itself becomes a respiratory organ because of the mucus. So that's because of this clitellum. It also helps hold in developing eggs in a pouch in this area when they're developing at that time. So clitellum is really, really important. So now that we've seen the external structures, we're going to begin to make our dissection. Now the best way to do that is to make sure you're going to lay it on its underside so that the back side is facing up. And if you pin it by the very end and by the very tip, you'll help to hold it straight. So we'll just start there. You can move your pins later on. And then we're going to begin the dissection by making small snips with our scissors. So I'll start down here by the tail, and you can start at the clitellum and work this direction and work this direction, whichever works best for you. Today I'm going to start down by the tail, and I'm going to make just small little snips, and if you take them just little ones, you're going to be able to make sure that your snips are very shallow. You don't want to go too deep or you will damage the internal structures. So I'm going to take little snips, and I'll snip all the way up here, and you can stop along the way, and if you open it up, you can see that it's kind of held together by little strings. Every segment seems to wrap around and hold it together. So I can take my teasing probe, which you will have, and you can use that to tease off the skin from the inside. And then we'll take one of these pins and we'll begin to pin it open along the way. So we'll go here and we'll take the skin on this side and we'll pin it along and kind of bend them out like that. It makes it easier to see, and then we can again loosen up that skin around it. And now you can begin to see a big structure in the middle, and this is primarily digestive tract. It also has a blood vessel that goes the whole length of the body. So we're going to continue to snip up all the way up and add pins as we go. So now that the earthworm is completely open, you can see all along there's a big, long digestive tract. The intestine goes the entire length, all the way from above the clitellum, all the way down out through the anus. So food goes in through their mouth and then travels all the way down and out through that direction. So now, really, all the interesting stuff really takes place above the clitellum. And if we look in this area up here, we can see a couple interesting structures. If we're talking about digestion, this area right here in these segments, this is segments like 11 through 15, you can see there's a little sac here and then followed by kind of a hard structure. The sac is the crop, and that's where food kind of goes in there and hangs out until it's ready to be digested. And the crop, then the gizzard here below it, has a little sand pebble project inside of it, and that helps to grind up the food before it goes down the intestine and is absorbed. So that's part of that digestion. In this area here, you see all these light-colored structures. These are reproductive structures. So when the earthworm wants to produce more, these structures come in handy. And then up in here, there's like a ganglion, kind of like their brain in some ways. And then the other thing that's interesting here, if I move away these reproductive structures, underneath, there's little dark kind of structures. And these are actually they're aortic arches, which are similar to a heart. So they help to pump blood down the blood vessel that travels all the way down the length of the intestine. So those are primarily all the structures that you'll find within your earthworm. You can see, as you probably noticed when you're dissecting it open, that every single segment has tissue that ends up holding the earthworm together. So as you saw, you had to tease it away to open it up so that the skin would be loose from the inside. And then really there's a whole cavity inside where the intestinal tract is. The clam did not have a cavity like this, so it's kind of unique in this organism, and all of the annelids have that kind of cavity. Thank you for joining our adventure as we study the clam and the earthworm. If you have any questions, let us know at bioboxlabs.com. Be sure you check out our Instagram and Facebook. We'd love to be part of your adventure.